You're like...
Yeah, like more. I have more channels, more extra information. But the main struggle really is in now using the information we have and making sense out of it. Yeah, and that's what I see for the future.
Stefan, obviously you also didn't have challenges.
Okay, we do maybe 30 to 50% of mobile compared to lab, roughly. It's hard to tell because it varies. Sometimes we have plenty of mobile studies going on, and sometimes everyone wants to go back to the lab, being frustrated with what's going on the streets. But hardware-wise, one big challenge for us is basically really moving towards higher channel counts in mobile situations. So we also use systems from other manufacturers, and unfortunately, some of them are not that easy to use in mobile situations. The level of, if you wish, technology readiness level for really street-level EEG acquisition is quite different for different systems, and that's a huge problem, clearly. So basically what Klaus mentioned, I think is really important. You could of course do like mobile with like high channel counts in more controlled lab, maybe virtual or semi-virtual environments, which is very nice. But of course we want to have the same level of information for true mobile or outdoors mobile as well. And therefore there's plenty of room for improvement for hardware and software development.
So we are currently, I would say, running about 70% mobile, and that includes the B-Mobile lab, basically the lab space, because it's dedicated to that specifically, but also outside the lab completely. And we're trying to move a little bit more outside the lab in the future. But we do have standard desktop scenarios, and when I say that, I also one of our approaches is trying to really understand the difference between Mobi and standard setups. So usually we have like a split experiment where we replicate the exact same visual flow kind of situation in a desktop scenario to be able to tell what is the difference when you start moving actively. I think the biggest struggle, so I'm in the luxurious position to outsource my mobile traumata to my PhD students. But I think there are two main sources of frustration for me from the very beginning, and that was timing in synchronization of different data streams. Event timing was like, and still is, a big issue. That always comes with uncertainty, whether the component that you see here is delayed or whether your event was delayed. Whether the smearing in your ERPs is based on jitter in your information transmission or not. Things like that. So the insecurity of some technical aspects and the huge efforts you have to make to measure that, really. And I think the second source of frustration, which might be way easier to overcome, is simply that we use only such a minimal part of the data that we record and really investigate, and that so much of the data is still out there and nobody uses it. And having said that, again, I think that's something to overcome by just sharing data and trying to establish like a more active exchange of these data sets. Yeah.
I definitely have a point on data sharing later on, so we're going to come back to this. And what is then how do you make a decision to do because you have fabulous lab to stay in the lab and do a simulation of some aspect that you want to investigate, or when do you want to go out? Do you make this consciousness? Is this the PhD student who is more driven to real life scenarios, or how do you make this transition? Because they're very different and very different level of risk probably also.
No, definitely. So for me, it's like a trajectory of having like a very controlled protocol in the lab using VR, trying to investigate the very basics and then move out into the wild where you lose control of certain things to see how much can you replicate things. And one of these aspects is obviously like secondary visual tasks as compared to auditory tasks, which directly impair your ability to watch where you're walking to see the trajectory. And this is like a resource issue that has not really been addressed systematically. I think that's something that we would like to look into. And then obviously there will be PhD students coming in with a very clear idea of what they want to do. And if they just have like a great idea that they want to do outside, then we just go outside. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. For instance, following ASR or some modification of ASR, we get very nice visual evoked potentials to eye blinks that similar to what Patrick Berg produced in the dark. So he had like those old papers from the 80s, I think, where they looked into eye blink event-related potentials in the dark and in the bright lab situation, and we get sometimes very nice responses that are at least compatible with ideas of some posterior occipital generation in OpenStreet's blink event-related analysis. For artificial intelligence, Bojana is playing with this, and in the field of auditory attention decoding, it's big now, and they perform better than more traditional analysis pipelines. That's certainly true. So whenever there is an application, then of course, yes, why not? It's worth a try in order to understand what's going on. Well, I'm not so sure we learn a lot. But from an application point of view, sure.
Okay, just go on ignoring your question.
Of course.
No, coming back to that. So I just would like to quote like a computer scientist that I've met like 5 days ago during a workshop, who stated that artificial intelligence for him currently is stochastics on steroids. And I think it's still, we are not at the point where we just have like really intelligent algorithms that would independently dive, but I'm not an expert in that, that would independently give us new information. But I completely agree with Stefan that we should try new approaches and not, stick with ICA because it did a good job until now. There will be situations, I'm pretty sure, where like other approaches might be better. And again, like Alejandro Ojeda just puts out, so we're working on a paper on sparse Bayesian source reconstruction approaches using also libraries of artifacts, which are only referring to a specific kind of movement again, right? So the range will be so different, so wide and individually also influenced, that I think this is going to be a huge challenge which will have to be continuously adapted to any new data set coming in. And this is going to take a long time, but definitely one way that we should go. So I'm open to any kind of new algorithm, AI. If there is a solution that helps in a certain way, then yes, why not? And back to Arnauld, I think that the ICA decomposition as done now using neck electrodes, for example, is working perfectly already. You don't have to regret, yeah. You have to regret a lot of things if you do MOBI, but if you want to regress, you don't have to regress muscle activity out because you get nice components reflecting muscle activity, so that's not necessary. But I do see, and there are papers out by Dan, again, that if you include neck band EMG activity by simply adding EEG electrodes lower than Indian, then you get significant information that help to improve the ICA decomposition. That's one thing. And coming back, I think that's not been discussed, getting out like artifacts from the environment, really artifacts from the environment. Dan also just put out this double layer electrode system. I don't know. Yeah. I thought this is like a super sexy idea that seems to work pretty well. And that is not the most expensive. So I would like to know which direction you're going with that, actually.
That makes Maarten smile because we tried this like 5 years ago. Never followed this up.
Technical issues and the work and the pain that we will have to go through, I think we need guidance. We need like standard protocols, how to approach that. There are standard papers in psychophysiology, for EEG recordings, for example, things like that. That has to be established in the field, including publication and group of experts basically giving this kind of a guidance. I hope that BITS is going to be part of that, but I think what is more important will be a change in researchers' perspective, basically, and that will be a generational issue. We're talking about changes from standard publication formats to pre-registered reports. These things, these pipelines, annotations, and basically describing exactly the way how you describe your data, describing events, and giving a standard shareable format for that will have to be established measures where nobody will think about in the future anymore that this is part of your recording. And only at that point we will be able to really share effectively. So it's going to be a change of mind that is necessary in the community. And I think it's a good time about that because lots of things happening right now, specifically in publication and pre-registered reports and open access data, that I am very hopeful that this will going to be the case within the next 10 years.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I have one final question that I'm often asked, and so I basically don't know the answer, so I want to ask you if you know it. There is also Elon Musk with Neuralink, the secretive company that's going to read inside your brain. Can you share your beliefs, hopes? Do you want to have it for research going invasive and getting even more neuronal firing, like, or is this all a bit hyped and we will see what's happening? If anyone wants to comment, I really don't know the answer myself. So,
if I might start, I think it's not too far from reality. If you look at wealthy Western industrialized societies and people that have enough money that inject testosterone and other hormones to improve physical health, if you see the need of people trying to augment their cognitive abilities, there will be populations that are eager to use things like that on themselves to improve. That will be a self-driven market that develops, that might create, and I would think it will happen, but it will also create a huge divide in society, push that even further between the parts of society that are able to afford this kind of technology and those that can't. But I'm more or less sure that it will come, yes.
Well, I don't see in the near future anything like a consumer invasive system. This is not happening, not in Europe. It's already a pain to do invasive, even in clinical cases. So Maarten has been working on a clinical BCI, invasive BCI, and this took, I don't know, 10 years of development or so. It's ridiculous. So what would be feasible, and there's now a first clinical trial I'm aware of, is minimally invasive chronic EEG. And that would be super interesting, where you have a subcutaneous system. If there's an infection, you take it out, no big deal, nothing really can happen. And if you are lucky, you can really collect data for weeks and weeks and weeks. Low density, but nevertheless, that would be a solution I would basically use myself easily. I don't have the system yet, but I'm working towards it.
So I think there are these two questions, right? One is ethically, and that's completely different from what it might give us scientifically. And there, I think any invasive system would be very welcome, because it would allow us to really compare that to the animal work that has been done. And I think this is really a link we have to make. There's beautiful animal work out there, and then we're here, like non-invasive, having a couple electrodes on the brain. So it would be beautiful to be able to integrate that. And for that, I think, yeah, it could be very useful, and I would look forward to data like that. But yeah, there is the other issue, of course.
You're closest to the source, so final comments.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Stefan, but it's like, you know, I mean, the risk of infection when you put anything inside the brain is just so big. Nobody's going to want to put this, you know, it's like even in soldier, even in the US for soldier, you know, it seems unlikely. So, yeah, I don't see it happen. But for research, or, you know, for understanding the way the brain works, or if there's new methods which are developed that makes it, you know, minimally invasive. Like in coma patients, they usually, when they record so one of the diagnostic to know if one person can recover is like you play sounds, auditory sounds, you put headsets, and you don't put electrode on the scalp, you just pins. You just put pins on the scalp because you want
If you take like the trajectory of technology development over the last 10 years only in the EEG sector, for example, this kind of technology has the huge advantage that have been done over the last years. I'm not saying this is going to happen in 5 years or in 10 years even, but wouldn't you consider the possibility just based on recent technological development?
I mean, it's possible, you know, it's like that we could implant humans, but is it going to happen? I don't think so.
I mean, before 1930, like external heart rate accelerators were like not common. This is like a standard procedure. I just got like 2 new lenses in my eyes.
I mean, it's true. Yeah, for maybe for Parkinson, because Parkinson, anywhere you implant electrodes within their substantia nigra. So maybe for a subpopulation.
If you look at the technological development, I'm not saying that I can envision how the system will look like right now, but just considering what happened over the last 10 years.
Thanks for this great discussion. I would also open up now the discussion to questions from the audience. Anyone who would like to? Yeah. If you can speak up.
Yeah, thank you for the panel discussion. I think it's great. There was something that really caught my attention from Stefan's presentation. That was the 30% reduction of the P300 amplitude when you did real life or walking P300 versus stationary P300. And as you said, it kind of points towards a more cognitive impact of that, a dual task element. And when we do real life EEG experiments, we're going to be bombarded with a lot of that dual tasking and cognitive distribution of resources. How versatile is the technology in mobile EEG now to allow for behavioral psychologists or cognitive neuroscientists to dive into these topics and start to disentangle them? It sounds so far that it's more restricted to engineers that can deal with all the problems with synchronization of different devices and everything to really start to get the benefit of this paradigms.
Well, I'm not an engineer, but I try to get close to as many engineers as possible. That really helps. Another story and another unpublished story. So when we did those studies, and we were pretty certain that okay, this is clearly reflecting some cognitive differences between the conditions. Then we ran another study. Maarten did this with a wheelchair condition, and the idea was, okay, is it more the passive complexity of the visual environment or the active locomotion contributing? And those data were terrible due to movement artifact. So the artifact from being wheelchaired on campus was so heavy that we could not really get rid of this easily. So here we really had a problem, and therefore we cannot really disentangle what's going on right now. Well, maybe with the technology we have now we could, but then we did not make use of any motion sensors, and now we have like a sensor network that would wirelessly link to LSL, and if this had like a high sampling rate, then of course we would like sample movements at different levels, maybe for artifact processing, but also for understanding what's going on, and that would bring us closer to explaining the difference. I think it's possible. There's no reason to be frustrated or shy, but of course you can expect some challenges to come up.
So I really hope I can convince you tomorrow that this is ready for some cognitive questions and that you can really use it. Yeah.
Any more questions from the audience? Sure.
So it's maybe a bit of an indecent question on the line. We like your mom or dad more. But we heard about many problems here. But if you had to state one problem connected to mobile EEG, what would that be? Would it be this muscle artifact cleaning that you want, or would it be something else? Dry electrodes, would it be invisible EEG? Would it be integrated ECOG? What would it be?
I think also the audience that has wishes can just shout them and see how much support you get for it.
I think that's a really difficult, for me it's a difficult question. I think one aspect of the setups that we run in Berlin is the sensor network that we have to put on. So dependent on the complexity, so the spot rotation experiment for the heading computation, we started with full body motion capture, and we had preparation times of like 2 hours before we even started recording one single data point. This is tiring, but necessary to get the dimensionality of the data. So if you come up with a morphing data suit that I put on within 10 minutes and I can start recording, I'd buy your system.
We'd certainly like to use off-the-shelf current Android versions with the system. That would be really cool. There are some challenges, and we'd definitely like to have motion sensors wirelessly connected to smartphone and integrate this also with high sampling rates. And there are some preliminary versions, but nothing that works easily out of the box. and that would be needed for many applications.
Right. I would just wish for more sensors, really, to actually more easily integrate like other signals, like the eye movement, but EMG. So basically, that suit, would do for me as well.
Yeah, it's more. I mean, I'm more traditional EEG. So for me,
you're
the question is more like your scientific question. You know, it's like find questions which are really relevant. You can't do with regular EEG because it's just simpler to do with regular EEG. You have to do with mobile brain imaging. So it's just a matter of the research questions which can only be answered using mobile EEG.
Do you want to comment?
I don't think that's a question of traditional or not traditional. I think we all agree that the research question is the most important in the end, and the equipment just serves to answer that question, I guess.
If you do it, like if you have a question that can be answered with both, you just use the method that's just simpler. I mean, you just ask your subject not to move, and they come in the lab, and you show them stimuli and.
But I know we enjoy the challenge.
Yeah. Which I think is a good question. Is like, what do you think is the type of question that can only be answered using mobile brain imaging for you guys?
Bogdan, do you want to?
I have a question. Klaus mentioned that he outsources his experiments to the students. So how many people do you usually have setting up an experiment? That's like just practical.
So you're talking about preparation in the lab of participants?
So you have an experiment in mind, so you have to set up all these sensors equipment for a specific experiment.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure some of them has already been set up, so on average how many?
Yeah, we do have like kind of a pipeline where several people are involved. So the question of what kind of motion capture system do we use? Do we use like the Valve or Vive HTC? Do we use like the virtual motion capture systems? Do we use like camera-based motion capture systems? That depends on the movement range. So the technician will be involved in the very beginning of these experiments. That also includes programming of the protocols, depending on what kind of environment we program and use. Students will be, the PhD student itself, he or she will be involved in that aspect already. Then if that is basically done, we come to the setup. That's like usually have one or two student helpers being in the lab with the PhD student helping preparing. So that's a pipeline, but in the end, in the lab, there will be like at least two people prepping participants, but the trajectory to that point, there will be like 3 to 4 people being involved in developing the whole setup. Yeah.
So are there any final wishes from the audience? Andrew?
Question, but with mobile systems, how do you, I can see a reviewer asking a question, well, how do you control for differences, across, subjects, one day it was sunny, one day it was plane was going on, so these types of, is the variability across those different things greater than the variability that you can see in, I can see that being the first question if I try to do something like this. So I guess, what have you done to overcome or control? I guess you can do sound level meters, you can do different things, but I guess what are some methods that you've done to battle that argument first?
Well, I think one of the easiest would be, and that is like the established approach that we have, if you have a new question that we would like to answer with Mobi, we try to mimic that in a traditional setup. Like the spot rotation thing that you saw, we have the same visual input in a standing non-moving participant. So we try to use a standard setup and compare that with a Mobi setup, and we try to be careful in what kind of protocols we use and what parameters. For example, if you go back to classical P3 oddball paradigm, you can show that you can replicate established parameters, and that is something that can convince reviewers, even though in the beginning, the first 5 years, that was a nightmare, and they would still not believe anything that came out of the data.
Well, we would log weather conditions during acquisition, and in Oldenburg it's rarely too hot, for mobile EEG. It's rarely to code. It's usually too wet for mobile EEG. That's a problem.
What was the question again?
What's the weather in
so
Würzburg?
I think yeah, right. So I think the thing is that as long as all these conditions are not locked to the question you're asking, at least in theory, they should average out, right? So the only problem is that you add noise, and that might really make your signal be not visible or not visible too easily. But that just means all these factors must increase your n, right? So you need more subjects. But I think, and of course you have to be really attentive. If there is any linkage to your question, then it gets problematic. But otherwise, I think it's a signal to noise question. It boils down to that.
I think we have lunchtime, so if Arnauld doesn't want to have any final words to add. Do you? He was like...
Another question about
no
ICA.
questions anymore.
Yeah, I mean, the question of inter-subject variability, and in your case, inter-environment variability, is central to EEG, and there is no definite answer to solve it. My personal solution is and I'll show that in my presentation, you just put all the parameters in the general linear model so it can regress out every single variation.
I like this as a final conclusion, so let's thank the speakers again. I found a very interesting discussion.